This episode, I'm joined by Louis Betty, who is an associate professor of French at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, where he teaches courses in French and the humanities. In this episode, we discuss his book, Without God, Michel Houellebecq and Materialist Horror, alongside discussions on secularism, meaning, post-materialism, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support Hermitix and get access to some exclusive content alongside keeping the podcast going, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. Louis Betty, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We are going to be discussing your book, Without God, Michel Houellebecq and Materialist Horror, which was, you said, initially published summer 2016 and then released as a paperback in 2017 by Penn State University Press.
Right.
As you can imagine, this is a book on the work of Michel Houellebecq, who people would know of his book Submission, most recently Serotonin, Atomized, whatever, and there's many more, of course, and also his monograph on Lovecraft and Schopenhauer as well, which is fairly recent, I believe. So before we sort of jump in with the work of Welbeck, specifically from this materialist horror angle, which we can also discuss the other scholarship which has happened on Welbeck from many different angles, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how it was this book came about.
Well, I did a PhD in French literature. I'm an associate professor at a university in Wisconsin, so that's very exotic if you're coming at things from Cambridge. I was in France when I was 25 as a graduate student teaching English, and I happened to read about Michel Houellebecq in an article in an edition of Time magazine, as it were, on the death of French culture, and it mentioned Welbeck as this kind of decadent figure, so I was interested. But part of the reason I was interested was because I've always had a deep interest in religion apart from literature. You know, I grew up in Central California in a very religious and very conservative kind of city. People don't think about that when they think California. They think LA, San Francisco. This is the other California. So I was surrounded by a lot of evangelical Christianity, a lot of Catholicism, because there's a large Hispanic population there. And then I go to France, and you have the phenomenon of, empty churches. There's nobody at the mass, and it felt very strange to me. And I was interested in how that happened and in how it might be represented in a literary form. And I've also been I sort of have the death watcher mentality too. So intellectually, I can accept that people can be secular or atheist and not be in despair about that, but I have a kind of gut thing where I'm a little suspicious, and so Welbeck shares that suspicion, right? Mm-hmm. And so the fact that he's talking about, the heavily declined Catholicism that you find in France today, and also the horror of a godless universe, really spoke to two twin interests, and then it just went from there, and it turned into a PhD thesis, and a few years later into a book. So that was the trajectory.
So, do you mind if I ask? Are you a religious person?
Yeah, I grew up Catholic, so okay. I wouldn't say I'm strongly or fervently Catholic, but I keep it up.
Okay,
put it that way. I wasn't at the time though. At 25.
Oh, you sort of Catholic, then atheist for a while, then back to Catholic.
Well, Catholic and just sort of maybe a little bit New Agey for a while, and then just back to I need to. You need to. There's this feeling that you need to be embedded in a kind of institution, and I got enough of Catholicism as a kid that you kind of feel like, well, this is what I've been given, so I'll try to keep it alive, out of deference to the past or to ancestors, and also because it's compelling in its own right.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, maybe that sort of biographical detail will come in terms of your own reading of why this book came around. But I have to ask you the Hermitix question before we go any further. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick? But I noticed in my question, I forgot to add that as we're talking about Welbeck is already in the room, and then you can add 3 more.
Okay, well, knowing him, I would definitely add Pascal and Schopenhauer. Mm-hmm. Those are 2 of, he has a whole book well, it's a short book, just an essay on Schopenhauer. And then I think that Pascal, frankly, is the root, at least of like kind of the philosophical aesthetic compound that is materialist horror. I mean, Pascal elaborates that perception of the world, I think, back in the 17th century. So Schopenhauer and Pascal. And then for the third one, I couldn't really, I mean, with Welbeck, probably Auguste Comte, who was another big influence. Comte being the guy who came up with the notion of a religion of humanity that was worshipful toward only human beings. All transcendent or spiritual content was completely evacuated. And yet there was this recognition that some religious element, an essential religious element, remained in people that had to be honored. So Pascal, Schopenhauer, and Auguste Comte.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the interesting things there is the I guess the admittance of the death of the transcendent, but as you say, still the retention of the idea that there is still some sort of religiosity about the world, right? So Schopenhauer has his leanings with Buddhism and the Veil of Maya, and he sort of interprets Kant in that form, but he doesn't lean on it too heavily. And as you say, with Pascal and Comte, there is still this thing. So do you think the conversation between the four would really gravitate towards the idea that they'd all accept the materialist, horrifying chaos that we're within, but maybe there would just controversially, there might be a seed of hope in that room between them?
Well, it's hard to say because the worldviews are so different. I mean, Pascal was, a Christian in the 17th century who was becoming aware in a kind of semi-horrified way of the vast scope of the universe and humanity's decentered position within it. Schopenhauer was a total skeptic, at least as far as monotheisms go, who found comfort in Buddhism and the religions of the East. And then, I mean, Comte was probably the most optimistic, but probably with the least reason to be optimistic, I might, because, I mean, maybe in the 19th century it was possible to be that enthusiastic about human beings. I don't know if that's the case anymore. So, yeah, I mean, they both have their comforts. So maybe something would shine through, but I don't know that it would be a compound of their thought. It would be everybody reaching in his own kind of imperfect way towards something transcendent. I don't know if that's a great answer, but it's
and also on the biographical level, I don't know the biographies of Comte or Pascal too well, but I know Schopenhauer is actually surprisingly very talkative. So I wonder if he would be the sort of the guy prodding the stick at the rest of the people. I think Welbeck would probably sit back and just chain smoke, right?
Oh, I imagine he probably would. I mean, Schopenhauer, I try to get my students to read him, and of course it's German being translated into English. But, in addition to his philosophical insight, he really was a great stylist and had a capacity for bombast and kind of enormity that makes you laugh. So I can definitely see him leading the conversation while Pascal probably broods. And I don't know what Auguste Comte would be doing. So. But Welbeck would definitely be smoking.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I remember reading Rudiger Safransky's biography of Schopenhauer and realizing that actually maybe as a person we get Schopenhauer a bit wrong, because as you say, he was this just well known as a sort of almost like a modern Diogenes, right? Just sat there really poking the wound of the world and really annoying people.
And that's what Welbeck he says in one of his early writings, that what you do as a writer is you find the wound in the flesh and you stick your finger in and you rub. So he's definitely an inheritor of Schopenhauer in that respect.
Okay. Well, I imagine these thinkers will come back in, but sort of moving into your book, just starting with sort of a really overarching question, which I think even in the books of Welbeck's, which aren't primarily focused towards religion, there is always this sort of unspoken element for Welbeck that we have killed something, it's missing, there's this lack of something very substantial, and that is admitted through the fact that the majority of what his characters do is completely apathetic. But from that is his admittance that thing really has no place anymore, whatever that thing might be. So do you think, I mean, I'll just put it plainly, do you think that the modern world which Welbeck perceives, and how he writes of the modern world is completely incompatible with religion. Like to have the two together is really a paradox for Welbeck.
I don't think, well, what I would say is that I think the way that he sets up that distinction is it's less evocative of reality as it is a kind of prop. I mean, there's a reality to it. There's an intelligibility to it. We can see ourselves in it as Westerners, but I do think it's exaggerated in a kind of experimental way to get the reader to really consider without any distraction, without any what ifs, right, without any escape hatch, what it means to live in a totally godless or materialistic world. Whether Michel Houellebecq himself sees things in such a black and white way, I don't know. I suspect he probably doesn't or has some serious doubts. But for the purposes of the work that his novels are doing, we don't want to be holding out the hope that there's going to be some happy ending here. It's a tool for us to get us to confront a certain conclusion and to draw everything logical from that conclusion, I think. So, yeah, I wouldn't say that modernity and religion are incompatible in any real sense, but for the sake of a literary experiment, it's a very good way to go about doing your writing.
It's something really interesting, that the idea of the idea you said about, you open a Welbeck book and you think like, well, I can't expect a happy ending. But actually the whole idea of an ending, I think, is immediately thwarted in Welbeck's texts, right? The world's so apathetic that you think like, I could almost, and I don't mean this like, he has to be an amazing stylist, an amazing writer. Otherwise, I think you would be like, this is exhausting. This is like almost like a lecture on how bad things are. But because he's so funny and because he's so witty, you stick with it. But as you say, with the idea of an ending, I mean, I remember reading Serotonin and getting to the point where the character begins to take I forgot the name of the Capronics, I think the drug, the
Apterix, something like Peptorix, I'm not sure.
To that point, and I remember thinking, Welbeck probably won't take this really anywhere else. I mean, the ending's already implicit that, well, you've no longer got any transcendent, you've no longer got anything you can get to. So I could almost put this book down and I don't think I'd be at a loss. I don't know if you agree with that. The idea of an ending in Welbeck, I think it's immediately changed from the worlds he creates, or from the worlds he sees, I would say. Yeah,
his endings are typically, there's some sort of either a conversion or a suicide typically. But in both cases, it's the, kind of the end of a former way of being. I have a weird kind of reading that I'm trying out of that novel that I don't know how well I can go with it here, but in some respects, I think it is, if there's any sort of ending that's being entertained, it's at least a kind of critique. I would say that it's kind of a post-materialist novel in the sense that material solutions to some sort of moral ill or moral failing, right? His failures in love, his failures in life, can't be resolved through a material, right, intervention. In other words, some psychiatric medication, right? They're not up to the task of dealing with, what might be reckoned, in a less secular time as sin. Like the reason that he's unhappy is because he's betrayed his loves, right? And there's no pharmaceutical intervention that's going to be able to undo the moral damage that's been done to himself. So, you see in the ending of that novel, he's contemplating his suicide, but it's all very figurative. And if you don't really know if he does it. He just imagines himself jumping off this building. So yeah, that's where you end up with it. Like, is this an ending? Is this not an ending? But anyway, that's sort of two answers in one. But,
do you think when you speak of materialist horror in your title, do you think that is almost the definition of the horror aspect of materialism, that it is inherently recursive, right? There's no escape hatch to materialism. And once you realize that there can't be a materialist solution to materialist problems, as you said.
Yeah, there's you see that in the elementary particles too, right? You have this attempt through quantum mechanics to break through the kind of more reductive materialist 20th or 19th century materialist rendering of the world. Does that really work? I mean, what's kind of weird is at the end of that novel, you don't necessarily notice it, but there's this modification of human beings, but they're covered with what are called Krauss corpuscles or something like that, which are like the things you find on a clitoris or on, a gland. So the human being is basically turned into an orgasm machine, right? So to the extent that that's an escape from materialism, I don't really know. Again, it seems to just to cycle right back to it, as you said, because, you can talk about quantum physics as much as you want, but not being an expert, I think I can at least say that, quantum particles or waves or however you run it, they're still part of the physical world. So I read that novel as a kind of false transcendence. And I think Welbeck, in a way, sees that in the elementary particles, where this future clone society ends up not being a utopia and collapses in the end. It just collapses back into matter. So, yeah, there's that cycling back, as you said. The attempt to escape from materialism just ends up reaffirming it in some more apocalyptic way.
Yeah, it's sort of like the acceleration of materialism to its absolute zenith, right? So if your MO as a culture is sort of this materialist utilitarianism, right? If you're materialist, then in the Schopenhauerian sense, right, you try and move away from suffering and boredom as the two poles of existence for Schopenhauer. You try and move towards pleasure, and that idea of a human that is basically, as you said, just head to toe in clitorises, like this orgasm machine, is basically the zenith of you can't get any more materialist or like pleasure seeking than this, right? But that in itself is a problem because you no longer have anywhere to go.
Right. You can only rub up against each other for so long in that state before it becomes, I don't know, boredom sets in. So, yeah. But it's that's what I've got to say about that.
Okay. I mean, the concept of horror is interesting. I've read a fair amount of the philosophy of horror, and I've always taken the definition from an author, a philosopher called Nick Land, who writes a lot of philosophical horror, and he I don't know what you'd make of this, but he defines the problem of modern horror is that the monster or the horror is revealed too soon, right? Once the horror is revealed, you sort of sat there like, well, I know it's a clown, right? I know it's a clown now, so I'm not scared of anything. So in terms of this materialism, if you'd agree with that definition of horror, what do you think the thing is which is like we're constantly trying to avoid, that we know it's there, but we can't define it? What do you think it is that is never seen and remains to be horrifying for us in this reality, for Welbeck, of course?
Well, I think for me, the most striking example of materialist horror comes in the elementary particles, where, in France, you get, I don't know if it's like this in the UK, like if you have a relative who's buried in a cemetery, you have to pay every 7 years to have them stay buried there. So apparently, his grandmother dies, but the fee hasn't been paid to keep the bones in the cemetery. And he goes out and he sees the grave being dug up, so the bones are moved somewhere else. And he thinks, he sees the bones, and there's this line where it says, and he understood. So there's like this, it's like a vivid encounter with the body, and where matter actually speaks to you and says, this is all there is. So it's a philosophical intuition, but it's also a kind of aesthetic intuition at the same time, right? So the horror is in just the irreducible physicalness of things. Like a person is just skin and bones. So it's, I guess I try to think of it as like, spirituality has been put in an airlock and just blown out, right? And you're not left with any other kind of escape hatch, right? You're just in the presence of decay. Right? So, in terms of the timing in which that's shown, I don't know if that's the way to think about it. In like the monster, the thing that shows itself. So I don't know if it's a matter of like how that happens in the spacing of his novels. It seems to be pretty intermittent, but also constant at the same time.
Do you think Welbeck deals with, that classical idea of death anxiety in a different way than is usually taken on? Usually the acceptance of the body, the acceptance of mortality in certain novels is taken as the character then changes something about their life. But do you think for Welbeck, it's almost like an emphasis of the meaninglessness of everything? It's not oh my God, I'm about to die. I should do something more with my life. It's like literally a reminder that we're just this flesh that's gonna eventually be that.
Yeah, because the question is, what is there more to do with your life if you've accepted those premises? If the dread of death is implicated with the loss of meaning that implies, then that can have an immobilizing effect. I think of Tolstoy, for example, in his Confession, where he talks about the question of life. Is there anything in my life that will outlive my death or the deaths of people who know me and who are close to me? So what if I'm as famous as Shakespeare? In the end, it's all the stench in the bones. So,
but he had God. He had God, though.
He did. I mean, he did eventually after he went through a conversion experience, but it was never an easy relationship with God. He went back to church, but he, the supernatural aspects of Russian Orthodox Christianity always just put him off. He was a man of the 19th century, and that kind of miraculous element in religion was just a tough sell. So a lot of his comfort in God, I think Tolstoy, was his constant searching for God. They came to kind of coincide with each other. So, yeah, I mean, if that's your premise, though, like if you're with Tolstoy at the very bottom of the well, where all you see is the dragon that's lurking up, waiting to devour you, it is easy to be immobilized. So what do you retreat to in that case? You just go back to, you try to animalize yourself, I guess. And you see that with Welbeck's characters, like the animal, or, the animal is the thing that does not see the future, that's not preoccupied by it, right? Just, in the way that, alcohol is tempting because it destroys the future temporarily, but the future comes back. So to annihilate yourself in sex, for example, becomes a temptation or a preoccupation of his characters. But of course, human beings being that duality of animal and spiritual or symbolic, they're never able to escape from it. So it becomes this recurring, it's like they're waking back up to the horror every time they leave the moment of immediate gratification. So it cycles back in that way.
It's almost like a dark, bastardized Buddhism, right? Like live in the moment, but the moment is bereft of all light and divineness, right? So I'm living in the moment, but the moment is of the flesh and is of material. So what's the best thing of the moment is sex, smoking, alcohol.
Yeah, and Welbeck, reading also, that's the one that's sort of a redeeming activity amidst all of that in his books. His protagonists tend to be readers, and Welbeck himself says somewhere that you can cure any depression just by reading for a couple of weeks. So maybe that's true.
Do you think you could cure such a depression by reading Welbeck for 2 weeks?
Well, with Welbeck, you get a lot of it's sort of, you get a lot of laughs and a lot of entertainment along the way, but you never finish the novel smiling, right? So it's kind of like the sad clown effect or something. Ultimately, his stories are tragic no matter how much humor you encounter along the way. And you need the humor there too, because you wouldn't even be able to get a third of the way through the book. That's how he brings you along.
But it's quite defeatist humor, I think. As you sort of said there, that he's bitingly funny. He's one of the few authors that has made me laugh out loud. But then within a paragraph, you sort of look back at the joke he made, and you think, that's actually pretty.
Yeah.
What did I just laugh at? I sort of laughed at the horrendous fate of this character because the only moment of respite was so sort of comically absurd that.
And I think that's an element of materialist horror too. I mean, that's part of my definition of it. I mean, on the one hand, you have kind of a philosophical definition, like, the encounter with the dead bones or this vivid, horrified realization of extinction or the worms or whatever you want to represent death with. But there's also this kind of aesthetic of it, which is like a kind of comical enormity, right? Where the way I think about it is, imagine going to a funeral and you're speaking with people who are bereaved, or maybe you're bereaved yourself. And people are saying things like, I miss this person so much. It's so sad that they're gone. The kind of things that people say at funerals. And imagine if someone to go up and publicly address everyone and say, what really bothers me about this funeral is it reminds me of my own death. And it should remind you of your deaths, because that's what's coming, right? Mm-hmm. So, that would be funny in an extremely dark way, because it's at the back of everybody's mind. But of course, you're not supposed to say something like that. But that's kind of what Welbeck does in a way, right? When you center death anxiety or existential dread that much, it has a comic effect, because it's incongruous with our natural tendency to try to play it down or deny it. So I think some of his humor, again, is a form of an aesthetic of materialist horror, putting the worm front and center.
But the worm's front and center, but he sort of continuously hides it, I think. Do you think that's the horrifying aspect? Is, as you say, like, the funeral is a reminder of your own death? Do you think Welbeck's sort of alienated world is consistently this, like, and then you have this moment of dwelling in your own reminder that you are in that world and you've definitely experiencing it? Maybe. Some listeners might not be, but it's a consistent reminder of that, that actually there's a lot in here which is a reminder of your own reality.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that, I would say he hides the worm. I think that's a good way of putting it, because you're, again, like what I was saying, the characters are drawn out into alcohol or sex or smoking, and then they're shot back into the realization of the inadequacy or the superficiality of that. There's a scene in Serotonin where, for one thing to notice about Welbeck's novels is that he's just drinking. These guys are drinking all the time. They're dreadful alcoholics. And, I think the character is somewhere in Normandy and just pounding Calvados in the middle of the night. And eventually the alcohol starts to wear off. And if you're drinking that much, you're probably going to get delirium tremens. So it seems like something like that is happening. But it's not described in medical terms, more like in spiritual terms. Like, he has the sense of like a presence in the room, something touching him. So there's this language of possession. So that's a good example for me of that being shot from one into the other, like from the reprieve through substance back into the horror that even takes on a kind of supernatural aspect in that particular scene.
Mm-hmm. So what would you define post-materialism as? It doesn't seem hopeful in the sense that it's really escaping anything, but yeah, how would you define it?
How would I define post-materialism? Let's think about that. In Welbeck's sense, I think it's again, it's just a materialism that is coming back in a different form, right? In the form of, in some sense, of a kind of a reanimalization of human beings. It's like, well, if the problem is that we as human beings, we have a spiritual, intellectual side that draws us out of nature, right? And gives us some sort of hope or inkling of transcendence, but we're always dragged back down by the body into halfway into the tomb. Maybe we can create a situation where we don't have to worry about our spiritual side anymore, and we can annihilate our anxiety about the future in the animal. And that's the elementary particles, I think, right? When, again, everybody becomes a giant walking clitoris, right? And so they don't have to be, they can just be creaturely in a deeper sense and kind of lose themselves. It's a kind of like comatose existence that he's hoping for. He even says somewhere that, I think it's in the elementary particles, one of the characters says, I've always thought that happiness and a coma were indistinguishable, right? So post-materialism seems like an even deeper kind of materialism in at least the elementary particles, where human beings become essentially a walking sex machines. But what's funny is you had a question. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna comment that it's sort of reminiscent of like a reverse Nietzscheanism, right? Animal man, Superman, but between each of these, there's always a few hints of each. But really, you want the complete reversion to animal, where there is, you almost want to cut the tether. So there's no longer we don't know about man. We don't want to know about reasoning, logic, attempting to figure things out, meaning. We don't want to know about that. It's pure, like, base vitalist being, and that's it.
Yeah, that's how the ending of the novel struck me. I mean, it tries to spiritualize it a bit more, and there's this sort of mysticism surrounding quantum mechanics and things I can't really speak to. But beneath that, I just saw, I don't know if I want to call it a failed attempt, but a kind of an unsure attempt to surpass materialism that just ends up, again, reasserting it, but without the duality of, the spiritual man and the animal man. Just the orgasm man, I think, is what emerges. From maybe that's the synthesis of the two. Okay. Something like that.
Okay. I mean, one thing I guess to add, which is it's tough to. It's really weird to talk about it because I actually had to look up other people writing on it, which is Welbeck's sort of notion of love, because you would think that someone who writes as Welbeck does would attempt to eradicate love in the sort of materialist manner of like, it's all chemicals, it's all, but whenever Welbeck mentions love, it's actually one of the places I think that this Welbeckian world perception consistently trips up, because it's not something it can deal with just with like the Welbeckian cynicism and wit, right? It's something that there's enough there for it to be a problem for Welbeck and for his characters. That's where they almost always, like, it would be easy for them to just go into a drug or alcohol-fueled stupor forever. But there's always like a few things, and love being one of them, where it's like, damn, just got caught up on this. Like, there's something there.
Yeah, it's typically the only oasis that's, ends up protecting his characters from the ambient materialist horror. It's the possibility of an island. That's the title of the novel. At the same time, love, it's reckoned as completely dependent on the body and a person's attractiveness. There's the character Danielle with his wife Isabelle at the beginning of that novel, and she gets to around 40 years old when he starts to find her less attractive. And there's this really pitiful and sad scene where he talks about when the physical goes, everything goes. Right there, he says there's no higher feeling, there's no deeper bond. When a person, they just become this body that oppresses you in your own home, and that certainly is, if you're living in some intensely Christian world, there's going to be some crutch that's offered to you. Say, well, okay, well, maybe you feel that way, but you got married, and marriage is a vocation. It's about childbirth, or having children, raising a family. A more traditional culture would offer a crutch like that. Whereas in Welbeck, there isn't any such crutch. There's just the body and its decline. And yet, right, love is not so easily dispensed with at the same time, right? But it's inevitably tied to physical attractiveness, right? It's not, at least in that sense, between two people. So it's carnal, but it's more than carnal. I'm not quite sure how he works it out. That's what I have to say.
I mean, it's interesting, on a sort of meta level, when I've had discussions about nihilism and things along these lines, and people such as Welbeck, like Émile Chiron, these people who are writing in the same sense, the conversations become difficult because you don't have any anchors with which to have the conversation. Right? You don't have God, you don't have, we can always bring this back to some meaning. It's almost immediately like an immanent, just fragmentary conversation. And I think in relation to Welbeck's writing, how do you think he holds these worlds together? Because sometimes it does just seem like the character like almost just appears, like it's just some random. It could be anyone from the world for Welbeck. It could be it could be anything. It's just this fragmentation which he's grabbed onto. I mean, it's an interesting question. Which, what I think, at least when I was doing the research, is how are these worlds? How does he manage to hold them together?
That's a really good question. I think underlying these worlds is there's a general critique of secular humanism or liberalism, or just the world that we've spun out of the Enlightenment that insists on the individual. So, in the sense that all of his works posit that worldview as a problem or as something that we're trying to escape but can't, I think that they hold together. They hold together in a sort of negative sense as reacting to, I guess, what's the word to use? The insolubility or the insolvency of that very humanist pretense to live for ourselves without God. And everything that happens follows in some sense or another from that initial statement, right? Or at least that initial kind of layering that's at the bottom of things.
Do you think it's all reaction? Do you think there's anything affirmative in Welbeck?
No, I don't think it's reaction. I think, he himself has said that, I'm not a reactionary. I don't think that you can go back in the past and relive a former time. So I think he's a nostalgic in a kind of romantic sense, right? He likes to play with the idea that things were better in a previous time, but there's nothing but the future ultimately in his novels. So no, I wouldn't say he's a reactionary. A reactionary is somebody who has to really work toward bringing back a past time, the way like Joseph de Maistre was, somebody who thought that the Ancien regime was going to reassert itself after the revolution in this kind of dialectical way. With Welbeck, it's nostalgia for a lost world of unity between people. Anyway, he's. I would not say he's a reactionary.
De Maistre. I mean, I'm a big fan of De Maistre, and De Maistre's actually quite a good example there, because I don't want to say he's Welbeckian, because that's going to conflate him with being a reactionary. But there is the often overlooked point in De Maistre that he was against the revolution, counter-revolutionary, but he also had to accept that it was the will of God. So he's sort of stuck in that Welbeckian impasse of, I know this is absolutely dreadful, but this is actually all we've got. But equally, we don't have a future because of it. So Welbeck's sort of saying, we can't go back. We've only got, as you said, the future, but also we do have to admit there probably isn't going to be much of a future. So you're just stuck in a complete impasse there. Or do you think I'm wrong in that?
No, I mean, I think that so long. I mean, I don't know that there's much future for a. I mean, this is where the issue of Islam comes in, I think, so interestingly in Submission, is that I don't think that novel really is about Islam in any substantial sense. It's about the West and about the dregs, you might say, at least as Welbeck is presenting them, of Western humanism. So again, Islam becomes a prop for exposing the hollow lives of just the modern European man or woman, and so it becomes a temptation for the characters, as it becomes a temptation for Francois. I don't see his conversion as being some purely calculated. I mean, there's a certain measure of calculation and pettiness in it. It's like, I'll get my job back, I'll have wives. But at the same time, Welbeck's work across the board, I think prepares readers of that novel to themselves feel a certain temptation in Islam, right? At the very least, is the resolution of the problem that he's been setting up. It's like, this is a religion that will assign you a place in the world. You'll know what your role is, right? You'll know what a man is, what a woman is, right? There'll be some transcendence on offer to you. So if you've really come along with me the whole way, Welbeck seems to be saying in my criticism, that is the framework, I think, for all of his novels, the critique of Western humanism. Why wouldn't you do like Francois does and just submit if you're so unhappy? So that's where the novel is sort of devious, I think, right, in the way that it drags the reader along.
Yeah, no, I have to agree. I think that's. I remember when a sort of anti-theist friend of mine recommending it to me, and I thought, Submission. But as you say, from memory, it has actually been a while since I've read it. But from memory, it isn't Francois and France itself. It isn't a matter of like, you will submit as if there's this overarching domination. It just sort of happens. It's like all of a sudden. I remember it being quite sudden. It's like, they fell into it, But I mean, I put in my question about this that it was sort of apathy, but I'm not sure it was apathy. It just strode into
I thought
comfort.
really a lot about that question. You know, I don't know that I call it like apathy or say retreat. I think was one of the words you used, like an exhaustion or a disappointment and false promises, right? You know, your average Westerner saying, you know, I should be happier in the world that we've created for ourselves, and I'm not. I have all these rights, all these freedoms, and yet something is missing. There's a sense of annihilation at the center of it all. So it's exhaustion. I mean, you could say, right, that if there's any apathy, right, it's sort of bred out of an indifference to a culture or civilization that doesn't really deliver what it's supposed to deliver. So it's like, well, why not just let it go, right? If it's so apathetic in that sense, but I really think it's more exhaustion and disappointment, right? With
Well, I guess the irony is that in the Western world that they've come from, everything's so utterly meaningless that to fall out of the world itself is equally unnoticed, because it is just, well, it doesn't mean anything to that world. So you were there as nothing, and you leave almost as nothing, right? So it can't really even be an apathy, because there's nothing there to really be apathetic against. It just doesn't matter. Like, oh, that person's become a Muslim. Like, we'll just keep on going.
Yeah, just keep on going. It's like, you know, if everything is meaningless, so is the fact that everything's meaningless. So why not go on with something else? So yeah, I mean, I don't, at the same time, I mean, I think that there is an element of meaning or persuasion or argument in conversion, though, at least in the dynamic between his, the guy who's, I guess, the dean or the president of the new Islamic Sorbonne, Rediger, and Francois. I mean, you know, Francois is presented with this sort of argument from design that Rediger puts in front of him. So, I mean, I don't know how ironically we're supposed to take that. I mean, Francois is drinking wine and is sort of semi-coherent as he witnesses this theological argument. But at the same time, I think that there is, you know, when you look at that conversion scene, there's an evocation of beautiful natural scenes. There's a sense of transcendence that's conveyed through the language that makes me think that that Francois has found something meaningful in Islam. You know, at the very least, an ordered world that maybe he doesn't believe in it. You know, with the fervor of, you know, it's hard to really say from the novel, but it's not just a, what was the word that you used? It's not just a retreat, right? And it's not completely unintellectual or a kind of rejection of any sort of argument, right? I think that can be kind of a slur against people who convert, right? That, you know, you're just retreating into a kind of childishness or a submission to something without reflecting on it because it's easier or because why not? You know, I think of it more like St. Augustine, right? This is a guy who came to Christianity at the end of a very long process of introspection intellectually and morally. And I don't think something exactly happens like that with Francois, but it doesn't exactly not happen at the same time, right? There's a great scene where he says, you know, I never really considered the fact that there might be a God. And my first thought of that was just dread and fear that somebody might be watching and I might be stricken with some sort of terrible disease as a punishment. So, again, it's if it were just sort of a retreat into some sort of childish, unthinking worldview, I don't think you'd have that level of moral introspection or dread or, in a sense, resistance on his part to the thought of there even being a God.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as I said, with these conversations, it's always difficult because you get to this point where, you know, what do you do? What do you do? It's almost like asking the question of, well, why is Welbeck? You know, actually, this brings me to the question that I you know, I have no answer for, and I hope you sort of perhaps do, which is the struggle of these conversations is that you don't have an anchor, as I've sort of said. You know, we're dealing with someone who's dealing with the meaninglessness, the nihilism of the modern world, and so you might wonder why and how can he keep writing, which I think after so many books and so many books which seem, as you sort of comment on in your book, to have this underlying appreciation of the nostalgic elements of religion and also even of sort of some traditions. Do you think there's, you know, Welbeck's sort of reasons for continuing to write. Do you think for Welbeck these books serve some sort of purpose? I mean, I don't want to conflate them all under one roof as well, because I think there is key differences between them.
Well, I mean, from a certain perspective, to associate, to talk about the purpose of writing a novel, it's not. I mean, he says he was asked when Submission came out, do you think your book is going to have some sort of effect on the world? He says, no, none whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Because if you want to change the world, write a pamphlet, sit down and say, this is the problem and this is how to fix it. Right. So in terms of what his works are accomplishing for himself, I don't know. That's sort of the mystery of the author. Why do you write? In terms of, my own engagement with them, what they've accomplished, I guess it's hard to say, because you speak about these things in terms of what they accomplish for you as a reader. And as a scholar, you try to develop a theory of what they're accomplishing more generally, what they're speaking to, what they're convincing people of, and the like. So, I mean, in my case, what this work has revealed is, or just articulated is, what is it like to live in a godless world, a totally materialistic world? What are the consequences of that for human beings, for societies, for civilizations? How do people navigate that kind of existence? So to the extent his work is able to open that up, I think, and get people to think about, I guess, the religious question at the heart of these debates about meaning that are often couched in secular terms or economic terms, and it's doing something productive. I don't know that it's doing something productive for him. Why he keeps? I mean, Submission would have been a great, novel for him to stop at in some way if he just, for some reason, just fell over his desk, because it's like, I read this and I was like, okay, finally, here's a novel where religion becomes explicit and the issue of conversion, right, comes right to the fore. But then, of course, you go back to Serotonin, which goes in a different direction. So I always thought that there would be a Submission-like novel, but I never thought about what might follow it, and I still don't.
Mm. It's interesting though that, as you say, with a pamphlet, as Welbeck, as you say, Welbeck says, if you want to change the world, write a pamphlet, and a pamphlet would say, "Here's the problem, here's our answers." But maybe the irony is that for Welbeck, he's writing sort of quite transparently about a world in which all of us collectively agree that there apparently isn't any problems, right? It's a great world to be in, but he's just writing about it quite unbiasedly, right? It's almost very bare facts. So it's like, see, there isn't a problem, but his style and his form allow you to see that there is, right? If you see what I mean.
Is it okay if I say I didn't quite follow you on that one?
Okay, what I'd say is he's writing about the modern world, and I think we could say that he's a critic of the modern world. He's quite critical of it, obviously. He sees it's very dead and very empty. But what I would say is, from his style, it's not always as if he's forcibly being cynical about the modern world. He's just writing about it very transparently. So I don't think he's actively trying to make the modern world look awful. I think he's just sort of almost like stating, like, this is what this person of the modern world is doing, right? They're going to the room. This person's just drinking. Then they jerked off, right? And that's it, like the bare fact. And because of that, the problem arises. But I don't think he's sort of trying to actively make it clear that there is a problem.
No, I don't think so either. I think that, I guess that would depend on how you read things on the ground in your own experience, right? Are things really so dreadfully godless and materialistic and horrible in the West that all we have to do, like the material, writes itself? I don't know. Is that seems to be what you're implying.
Maybe that's an interesting idea, though, right? I'm a religious person, and you're a religious person as well. So perhaps we are approaching it from our own bias. Maybe some people would read it and they say, "Oh man, that Serotonin, that was such a funny book," and they just they didn't see anything bleak in it. You never know. Someone who's so steeped in the modern world, they might just go, well, why is this guy just writing about life?
Yeah, that's just how things are, and what's the problem? I think that it might have to do to some degree with, like, at what age you come to Welbeck. I think if you're reading him, when I discovered him at 25, you're still young enough to not have like, you know, had a serious illness or sort of felt, the clock ticking in the way that somebody who's, getting into their 40s might. So it might be harder to read him at a certain age where you feel more, I mean, not obviously intentionally targeted, but like you're more clearly a Welbeckian character at a certain age, like say 46.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of his characters are right around 45 or 46. I think Baudelaire died at 46 or 47, and that's part of the reason he's given that age to a number of characters. So I have wondered about that, if how you react to Welbeck isn't just about how you feel about the modern world, whether you're secular or religious, but also about what age you are. In novels where age is such a preoccupation because age means youth, or youth means that you can indulge yourself as much as you want without any consequence. So it may be that the older you get, I mean, maybe at some point I'll reread Welbeck and I'll read something that I thought was funny, and suddenly it won't be funny anymore because I'll see myself too much in it.
Yeah, it'd be a lot easier to shrug a lot of Welbeck off. I mean, I'm only 27, but I think if I was to read him at 17 to 18, 19, I think a lot of it could be shrugged off as some sort of joke.
Yeah.
And
first things aren't just terrible. It might not even be intelligible to you. So
yeah, that's true. Like, you need to be in the world long enough to be able to notice some of the things he's on about. Otherwise, these characters might almost seem as caricatures. The problems aren't really problems at that age, right? At 17, 18, drinking and chain smoking all day, it's no problem.
Well, at that age, you don't really know that you're going to get old and die. Like, it's not, it in a kind of intellectual sense, but I think it was right around when I was 25 when I was discovering Welbeck that I realized, oh, wait, this is going to happen to me too.
Mm.
But some part of the mind rejects that or doesn't know it, I think, at a certain age. But Welbeck can correct that, I think, if you're reading him carefully. Not you necessarily want to be corrected in that way, because it's that you're drawn into his horrors.
Well, I think if you're of a religious mind, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but Welbeck's almost Welbeck's works, as great as they are almost like a vindication, right? If you're very pious, then it's almost like an emphasis of like, this is why I have this retreat. This world is the world that I'm trying not to enter into. Yeah, I mean,
if people who are of a more conservative or religious mindset who read Welbeck definitely see it that way. Like, they think, here's a writer who himself is kind of compromised morally, or at least his, the content of his novels is certainly morally compromised, and yet he's revealing the world as we see it. Right? Like, Europe is this post-Christian decadent place, and Welbeck is kind of our sort of uncomfortable ally in making our own critique. So that's something that you won't necessarily find that in a lot of the academic literature, but just among cultural commentators. Like, there's a guy, Rod Dreher. He has a blog, and he's gone on about Welbeck quite a bit and sees him as this kind of very imperfect kind of voice crying out in the desert, revealing the decadence of a quickly declining civilization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
I read Dreher quite a bit.
Yeah,
he's funny.
Yeah.
So what do you think people get wrong about Welbeck?
Well, I think that one of the things is within the academy, there's such a focus on issues involved, broadly speaking, with critical theory, things having to do with race or sexuality or gender, and that's certainly a legitimate way to talk about Welbeck. But whenever I've been in conferences and people bring that up, they're like, well, what about this sexist thing that he said, or this racist or homophobic thing he said? I always grant the case. I say, look, there's no doubt that this guy he's going after everybody, right? He's like a Don Rickles of novelists, just makes fun of everybody, shouting out in the crowd, anybody he can provoke or mock. And I say, yeah, that's all there. I just think that the interest of his work lies elsewhere ultimately, and it lies in its critique of materialism of the Western variety, even as it offers very imperfect remedies.
I guess the irony is as well that in pointing out the sexist, maybe the homophobic, the racist things which are happening in Welbeck's novels under his voice, isn't, it's not as if he's an anomaly. Welbeck's sort of pointing out that the world is rife with that. These characters are just normal people, right? So it's not, wherever you stand, I'm not trying to excuse Welbeck if that was his own position. I merely think he's just trying to bring to the fore, like, you guys think you have all this social justice, but I'm giving you the real sort of gritty reality of the average person. Like, I'm just saying I'm just showing you what's there.
Yeah, I mean, his characters are not typically very remarkable. It's like they work for the government and they go on a vacation to the Canary Islands, and they have normal sort of middle class opinions. And I mean, that's another one of the issues that comes up with what is the responsibility of a novel, and what does it mean to render something that's offensive in a novelistic way? It's like people tend to just look at sentences or look at words, or just they don't even pay attention to the word. They pay attention to like the flavor of the word or something. And so it's easy to go through Welbeck. And if you want to be that way, like, well, there's this one line here, there's this one line here, he says this, but that's not really how you read literature, right? No. Unfortunately, I don't encounter too much of that in academic scholarship. Most people, I'm pretty good at seeing through that and getting it more interesting issues. And they're not just ones having to do with materialism or religion like I'm doing. I mean, there's a good book by Douglas Morey, not Douglas Murray, Douglas Morey. He teaches at University of Warwick. That's where he is. It's all about Welbeck and post-humanism and looking at things from that lens. And that's a really good book. So there's a lot out there that escapes bad reading of Welbeck, I think. But the New York Times, for example, has been consistently dour about Welbeck, and I've always been kind of. I wonder if it's like an exercise in American Puritanism in some way. It's like they can't see through the sex and the provocation, and it's like you're the newspaper of record and you're writing about a renowned French author. Come on, it's frustrating.
Or it's sex, drugs, smoking, drinking, but it's not on their terms. It's not fun. Yeah. It's not like liberatory, emancipative sex. It's like a sweaty, sort of half-drunken motel.
It's sad.
Yeah, sad, despairing.
Like exactly.
Yeah, so it's not on their terms of like the new, I guess all the liberatory politics that are around. It's like, we don't want the reality. We don't want reality.
No, we don't want that. Too much reality coming from Welbeck. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, where would you advise people to begin with Welbeck? Just from the beginning, or do you think there's like a key novel that you really think is a masterpiece?
I mean, The Elementary Particles is definitely. I mean, that was his breakout novel. He had one before it. He had Whatever, and he had the book on Lovecraft, and he had actually published a lot of poetry in the 90s. But The Elementary Particles was his succès de scandale, his success by scandal, and it's if you're interested in Welbeck as kind of a guy who makes a worldview statement, or at least a worldview critique, who wants to attack the biases or the prejudices of an entire civilization as he sees it, that's the place to start. Like if you want to fish for a big catch, that's the place to go. In terms of his most readable, his most fun novel, I would say Platform. That's the one that I find the most enjoyable. And then if you're interested in, issues of, say, Islam and immigration and all of that in Europe, which is, front and center right now, and has been since 2015, with the sharp Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan, obviously Submission is a sort of semi-prophetic work, I guess, is a great place. So I'd probably start with either Submission or The Elementary Particles, and work in Platform.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the first novel, Whatever, is also it's short, and I think sometimes it can be a little overlooked.
Okay. Do you think his work will stand the test of time?
I want to think that it will, because I've invested a lot in it, and it depends on. It depends on the kind of world we're living in, and in say 2050 or 2060, if we're living in a more religiously traditional world, either through more prevalence of Islam, say in Europe, or renewal of Christianity, or any of those possibilities. His work could be looked back on as a kind of a canonical statement about the world that this new culture or civilization has left behind. So it would serve. I'm trying to think of an example of that, but I'm coming up with a blank. So, I think that to the extent that scenario is likely that we're living in a more religious world by 2050 or 2060 for whatever reason, I think there's a good chance that he'll be appreciated as a kind of a prophetic novelist who, maybe some of the humor might be a little less intelligible because you kind of have to be in the moment. But something in the broader critique, I think, will be appreciated.
And you say you're now working on another book?
Yeah, I'm working on some pretty controversial people. There's Eric Zemmour, who's maybe running for president. So there's a guy named Laurent Oberton.
No.
Obertone. He's not really a literary figure. He's written some novels that are kind of roman d'anticipation, kind of, novels trying to anticipate the future. But in 2013, he wrote this really provocative book, or published this provocative book called La France Orange Mécanique. It's like France Clockwork Orange, where he goes into the issues of violent crime in France and the relative impotence, as he sees it, of the justice system. So he's kind of one of those compilers of data, who just consistently says all the things that you're not supposed to say in a polite society. In 2013, in this book, he used the term ensavagement to describe, the issues, the problems of crime in certain suburbs and places around Paris and the like, sensitive topics. So I'm attracted to, if anybody who's saying the thing that you're not supposed to say, I get very interested in that as a scholar, and I kind of want to pick it apart and try to articulate it back, especially if it's something that we might not be aware of in the English-speaking world, and then kind of lay it out there for people to consider on their own. So yeah, there's a number of writers within that, I guess, that general arena of voices of warning that I think could get a little bit more attention in the English
tradition
world.
Of that in France, though, right? I'm thinking of probably the book I shouldn't mention, but is it The Camp of the Saints?
Yeah, that was one.
Those kind of books which are about, should we say, replacement.
Yeah,
very abstractly replacement. And there's also Guillaume Fay.
Not sure. I know. Well, the guy who came up with the term, the Great Replacement, that's Renaud Camus. Right? And he's the guy. He's written a ton of work. If you read all of Renaud Camus, you would have read the equivalent of like 10 Bibles. The guy just pumps out 1,000 pages a year, just of his journal and all this stuff. But he's the one who came up with that term, and so I'm trying to kind of grapple with him and how do you because the idea has been appropriated by so many people in France, like it's a rallying cry. So, and it's been refracted through English-speaking media in obviously very critical ways, and so I'm grappling with a way to present his idea and other things about him in a way that is kind of neutral, that allows people to weigh it. So, it's sort of dangerous territory, I guess, but it's there are just a lot of people like that, and a lot of thinkers like that in France who they're too smart, I think, and they're too adored by certain people, and they're too influential for just to kind of ignore them. Right? So I think that's the broader issue of kind of responsibility to the reality of the full debate going on, rather than just kind of wishing certain things away. So
and whether or not you agree or disagree with these people, history shows that the worst thing you can do is just shove it under the rug, right? Because that's
exactly.
That's just going to become an explosion at one point, which you then can't control.
Yeah, I mean that is the premise of Laurent Auberton's novel. I mean, he imagines France erupting into a civil war. And it's really not a civil war because it's not clear who's fighting whom. There are all these different factions. And it's not like a very literary novel, but, it's kind of this, he's speaking to a background anxiety among a lot of people. And, the fact that a novel like that, or that preoccupation in France, that worry, is just that's not something we can ignore. Right. And so part of me just wants to make France as it is, or at least as I see it going into 2021, 2022, a bit more intelligible. And I think to do that, you have to get at the underbelly a bit, even if there's a certain amount of risk in that.
Yeah. No, I agree. So whereabouts can we find your work, and whereabouts can we find Without God, the book on Welbeck?
Yeah, you can go on Amazon, right, and just type in Without God, and it comes up. It was published by Penn State Press, so if you go on their website, it's the Pennsylvania State University, so it would be available there. And then my other work is basically just academic journal articles. So if you have access to a university library, and you type in my name and Welbeck on the Modern Language Association website, some things will come up. Other than that, though, I have a review of Serotonin that I published in the Los Angeles Review of Books. That is, shorter than an academic article, and it's more written for the layman rather than for the academician. So, yep.
Okay,
that's where I look.
Yeah, it seems like a good place to finish up. Louis Betty, thanks very much.